"I'm only a cook," she whispered, and the rain came down so hard on the tin roof of the spring house that she wasn't sure he'd heard her at all. But her name was Maren Colby, and she was on her knees in the mud outside the Ashworth ranch house at 11 o'clock at night, gathering up the shattered pieces of a blue china bowl that did not belong to her, while the man who owned that bowl and that house and every acre of grass for 6 miles in any direction stood over her with a lantern that shook a little in his hand, though whether from the wind or something else she could not have said. "Leave it," Holt Ashworth said. His voice always came out lower than the moment called for, like it cost him something to spend words at all. "Leave it, Maren. It's only a bull. It was your wife's," she said, and her hands did not stop moving, because her hands never stopped moving, not when the roof caught fire, not when the baby wouldn't quiet, not when the whole county seemed to have decided she was a woman who did not deserve a roof of her own. She picked up a shard so sharp it opened a thin red line across her palm, and she did not flinch, because flinching had never once put supper on a table. That was the moment, her kneeling, bleeding a little into the mud, refusing to look up at him, that he crouched down across from her, took both her wrists in his big rancher's hands, and said the thing that would end up rearranging the whole shape of her life. "You are not going anywhere. If you have ever been told you were less than you knew yourself to be, if you have ever built a life out of being useful because no one taught you that you were allowed to simply be loved, then stay with this story to the end, because it is for you. Tell me in the comments what town you're watching from tonight. Hit subscribe if stories like this one feel like home to you, and settle in, because Maren Colby's story does not go the way the town of Larkspur Hollow expected it to go, and by the time it is over, you will understand exactly why the wealthiest rancher in the territory got down on his knees in the mud for a cook. It had not always been mud and broken china. 6 months before that night, Maren had arrived at the Ashworth Ranch with a carpet bag holding everything she owned in the world, which was not much: 2 dresses, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a small tin of cinnamon she had carried across 4 counties because it was the last thing her husband had ever bought her before the fever took him. She was 28 years old and a widow, and in Larkspur Hollow a widow without children and without money was a kind of ghost that respectable people were polite to and never quite looked at. She had answered an advertisement pinned to the mercantile board: "Cook wanted, Ashworth Ranch. Live-in position, must be capable with children." She had not asked how many children, because a woman in her position did not get to be particular. When she arrived at the ranch house, a great square building of good gray stone with a wrap-around porch that looked out over more land than she had ever seen belonged to one family, she found out exactly how many children there were and exactly how much silence a house could hold. There was Josephine, 13 years old, who ran the household like a foreman running a crew, because someone had to, and no one else seemed capable. There was Daniel, 11, whose anger came out of him in short, violent bursts: a slammed door, a kicked bucket, a cutting word flung at his younger siblings, and whom Maren understood within the first week was not an angry boy so much as a grieving one who had not been given anywhere to put it. There was Ruth, 9, who had not spoken a full sentence since her mother died, and who spent her hours at the kitchen table with scraps of muslin and a needle, stitching small, strange, beautiful shapes that no one but Maren seemed to look at closely enough to understand. There was little Sam, 6, who would sometimes stop in the middle of playing and go very still, sniffing at the air, because his mother had worn lavender water, and some nights the wind carried a ghost of it up from the garden, and he was terrified, in the plain, unashamed way small children are terrified. That one day he would forget what she smelled like entirely. And there was the baby, not yet 1 year old, who cried almost without ceasing, as though her small body had absorbed all the grief the rest of the house was too proud to show, and who Maren took to calling her little watchman, because that baby's crying always seemed to know, before anyone else did, when something in the house was wrong. And there was Holt Ashworth himself, 34 years old, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, a man who had built the largest cattle operation between the Sabine and the Brazos with his own 2 hands and his father's stubborn will, and who had, in the 18 months since his wife Eleanor died of the same fever that took Marin's husband, gone quiet in a way that unsettled every hired man on the place. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. He simply stopped finishing sentences that got too close to anything that mattered, and the men who worked his land had learned to let those sentences die unfinished, the way you let a wounded animal alone until it decides to heal on its own terms or not at all. Marin had a rule, one she had built for herself in the long gray months after her husband's death, and it had 3 parts, and she followed it the way other women followed scripture. Never cry in front of others. Never ask for more than the minimum you need to survive. Always give the credit away. It was not a philosophy. It was a fence she had built around the parts of herself that could still be hurt, and she had gotten very good at living inside it. She did not expect, when she took that position, that a house full of grieving children and one silent rancher would spend 6 months quietly, patiently, without either of them quite noticing it happening, taking that fence apart board by board. It began with small things the way it always does. Josephine, exhausted from carrying a household on shoulders too young for the weight, snapping at her one afternoon over a burnt pie crust, and Marin not defending herself, only saying, gently, "You've been doing my job and yours both for a long while now, haven't you?" And watching the girl's chin tremble before she turned and walked out of the kitchen so no one would see her cry. It was Daniel, 3 weeks in, kicking over a pail of milk on purpose, glaring at Marin like he was daring her to send him away, and Marin simply fetching another pail and saying, "Milk spills. It isn't the end of the world. Go on and help me with the next one," and something in the boy's shoulders coming down 1/2 inch, like a man setting down a sack of stones he'd been carrying too long. It was Ruth, silent Ruth, sliding a scrap of stitched muslin across the table to Marin without a word one evening, a small crooked birdwing spread, and Marin understanding without being told that this was the closest thing to a gift the girl had left in her to give, and receiving it with both hands like it was made of gold because to her it was. It was little Sam one evening in the garden at dusk, going still and frightened, and Marin kneeling in front of him in the lavender bed itself, crushing a few leaves gently between her fingers and holding them up to his nose. "There," she said. "Now you know where to find her, whenever you need to." The boy had cried then, hard, the way children cry when something enormous finally has somewhere to go, and Marin had held him and not said a single word, because some grief does not need company, only witness. And it was Holt. It was Holt standing in the doorway of the kitchen more evenings than he would have admitted to any man on the ranch, watching her work, watching the way she moved through the chaos of feeding 6 people, with the calm of a woman who had decided long ago that panic was a luxury she could not afford. It was Holt beginning sentences, "Marin, I wanted to say," or "I've been meaning to tell you," and then stopping the way he always stopped before the vulnerable part, until one evening in the 3rd month, drying dishes beside him because he had, unasked, picked up a towel to help her, she had simply said, without turning to look at him, "You start the sentence, and then you leave the room in your own head before you finish it. I've noticed." And he had gone very still and said nothing, and she had let the silence sit there between them, comfortable as an old chair, because she had learned in her own grief that some men needed the door left open longer than others before they'd walk through it. She did not think of it as falling in love. She thought of it, if she thought of it at all, as being useful in a house that badly needed usefulness, and she told herself that was enough, because it had to be enough, because women in her position did not get to want more than the minimum required to survive. She was wrong about that. She would find out exactly how wrong before the year was through. But first, Larkspur Hollow would have its say. And Larkspur Hollow, in the shape of one particular woman, did not intend to let a cook and a widower's silence turn into anything at all. Her name was Constance Whitmore, and she was the wife of the town's leading banker, and she had appointed herself, some years back, guardian of every standard of propriety Larkspur Hollow possessed. She organized the church socials. She decided who received charity baskets at Christmas, and who was made to feel, in 100 small, unspoken ways, that they had not quite earned one. She had, in the 18 months since Eleanor Ashworth's death, made it her particular mission to see that the widower rancher and his 4 motherless children were properly looked after, by which she meant looked after by someone of Constance Whitmore's own choosing, her niece, in point of fact, a pleasant, pale young woman named Priscilla, who Constance had been quietly steering toward Holt Ashworth's ranch house for over a year, the way you'd steer a good heifer toward a prize bull, with patience and a firm hand on the gate. The arrival of a live-in cook, and a widow at that, and a widow who was, Constance noted with a curled lip at the next quilting circle, entirely too comfortable in that kitchen, entirely too familiar with those children, was an obstacle Constance Whitmore did not intend to tolerate quietly. It began with whispers. It always begins with whispers. She built and built and built. Every week gave her fresh material, and every week the whispers grew a little sharper, a little more pointed, until Larkspur Hollow itself began to feel less like a town and more like a slow-closing hand around Marion Colby's throat. Josephine came home from the mercantile one afternoon with her chin held too high and her eyes too bright, the particular posture of a child trying not to cry in public, and when Marion asked her gently what was wrong, the girl finally broke. "What?" they said. Josephine's voice cracked. "Mrs. Ledbetter said you're only after Papa's money. She said everyone knows a cook doesn't stay in one house for 6 months unless she's got her eye on something bigger than the pantry. She said," and here the girl's composure gave out entirely, and 13 years of holding a household together came apart in Marion's kitchen. "She said Mama would be ashamed of Papa, letting a hired woman get so close to us." Marion did not say anything for a long moment. She set down the knife she'd been using to peel potatoes, and she wiped her hands on her apron, and she pulled Josephine into her arms the way she imagined Eleanor Ashworth might have done, though she had never known the woman and had no right, she told herself, to imagine any such thing. "Your Mama," Marion said quietly, "would want you fed and clothed and loved, and not carrying this whole house on your back at 13 years old. That's all I know for certain. The rest is gossip, and gossip doesn't put supper on the table, so we won't be paying it any mind tonight." But that night, alone in her small room off the kitchen, she cried, silently into her pillow, breaking her own rule for the first time in longer than she could remember, because the truth was that the whispers had found the one soft place in her armor, the fear that had been sitting quietly under everything since the day she arrived, that she had let herself become something she had no right to be in this house, and that everyone could see it plainer than she could herself. She resolved that night to build the fence back up. She would be more careful. She would keep more distance. She would remember, going forward, that she was only a cook, and that a cook who forgot her place brought trouble down on children who had already suffered enough of it. It was a resolution that lasted exactly 11 days, until the fire. It started in the hay barn on a dry, windless night in early autumn. The kind of night no one expects trouble from, which is precisely the kind of night trouble tends to choose. Marion woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of the baby screaming louder than she had ever screamed, and by the time she reached the nursery, she found smoke curling thick and gray along the ceiling, and Ruth standing frozen in the doorway, unable to make a single sound to call for help. There is no time, in a moment like that, for offense. There is no time for rules about minimums and credit given away. Marion scooped the baby up in one arm and grabbed Ruth's hand with the other and half-carried, half-dragged both girls down the stairs and out into the yard, where Josephine was already herding Sam and Daniel toward the well. and where Holt Ashworth came pounding out of the barn himself, soot-streaked, having been the one to first smell the smoke and given the alarm, shouting orders to the hands who came running from the bunkhouse. The barn burned. Half the hay stores went up with it, a loss that would have crippled a smaller operation and would sting even one as large as Holt's. But the house stood, and the children stood, all 5 of them, gathered in a huddle in the yard in their nightclothes, while men fought the blaze with buckets and wet sacks and grim, silent determination. And it was Marin who held that huddle together. Marin who kept the baby quiet against her shoulder. Marin who kept Ruth's hand in hers, and Sam pressed against her side and Daniel close enough to touch, even though the boy would never have admitted he wanted to be. When the fire was finally beaten back to embers, when the gray dawn came up over a ranch that smelled of char and relief in equal measure, Holt Ashworth walked across that yard filthy and exhausted, and stopped in front of Marin Colby, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has just understood he cannot afford to lose. "You didn't have to do that," he said. His voice was rough with smoke. "I did," Marin said simply. "They're my children too, while I'm under this roof." And then, hearing herself say it, she flushed and looked away, because it was more than she had any right to claim, and she waited for him to correct her, to remind her gently that she was hired help and the children were his alone. He did not correct her. He only nodded, slowly, like a man setting a fact down carefully where he wouldn't lose it, and said, "I know they are," and walked away to see to the horses, leaving Marin standing in the ash-smelling yard with her heart pounding harder than it had during the fire itself. That should have been the turning point in a kinder world, it would have been. But Constance Whitmore heard about the fire the very next morning, in the way that everything reached Constance Whitmore within a day of happening, and instead of relief that the children were safe, she found in the story a different kind of opportunity. "A cook," she said to her quilting circle, her needle pausing delicately over her work, "carrying his children out of a burning house in her nightclothes in front of the hired men. I do wonder what Mr. Prohl, Ashworth's late wife's family, will think when word reaches them of how familiar the household has become." She let the sentence hang there, unfinished, the way a stone hangs in the air just before it drops into still water, and watched the ripples spread outward exactly as she intended them to. By the end of that week, word had reached the bank. Mr. Aldous Whitmore, Constance's husband, held the note on the eastern grazing lease Holt Ashworth had taken out 2 years prior to expand his herd, a note that had, until that week, been a matter of quiet routine renewal. Holt Ashworth had never once been late on a payment in his life, but a note is a note, and a banker can find any number of technical reasons to call one due early if he is sufficiently persuaded that it might be in his interest to do so. And Aldous Whitmore, prompted by a wife who had decided that the Ashworth household required a firmer hand than it currently possessed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Holt read it standing at the kitchen table, his face going the particular still, gray color of a man doing arithmetic he does not want to be doing. And when Marin asked, gently, what was wrong, he did not do what he always did. He did not start a sentence and stop before the vulnerable part. He told her everything. The note called due in 30 days. Full payment or the eastern grazing land. Nearly half his usable range, the land his herd depended on to survive the coming winter, would revert to the bank. 30 days was not enough time to sell enough cattle at a fair price to cover it, not without ruining the herd's breeding stock for years to come. 30 days was, Holt said quietly, staring at the letter like it might rearrange itself into better news if he looked hard enough. About the length of time it takes a certain kind of woman to decide she doesn't like the company her neighbor's been keeping. "This is because of me," Marin said. It was not a question. "This is because of small people with small grievances," Holt said. And for the first time since she had known him, there was real heat in his voice, real anger, banked low and dangerous like a fire under ash. "This has nothing to do with you, Marin, and everything to do with a woman who cannot abide the world moving in a direction she didn't order. But Maren, lying awake that night, could not make herself believe him entirely. Her fence, the one she had spent 6 months letting fall apart, board by board, went back up all at once, hard and fast, because here was the proof, wasn't it, of exactly what she had always known, that a woman like her wanting a life like this brought ruin down on people who deserved better than ruin. She did not tell Holt what she decided to do. She simply began the next morning to make her plans to leave. She was 3 days into those quiet plans, a letter half written to a cousin in the next territory who might know of a position, a carpetbag pulled out from under her bed and dusted off when Ruth found her. The girl came into Maren's small room at dusk, silent as always, and set something on the bed beside her. It was a piece of stitched muslin, larger than the small crooked birds Ruth usually made, and when Maren unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. It was the whole family, stitched in rough, simple, achingly careful thread, 5 children and 1 tall man, and, standing among them, unmistakably, a woman with dark hair and an apron, her arms spread wide enough to hold them all. "Ruth," Maren whispered. "Ruth, honey, can you tell me what this means?" And Ruth Ashworth, who had not spoken a full sentence in 18 months, looked up at her with enormous, solemn eyes and said, in a small, rusty, unpracticed voice, "Don't go," Maren cried then openly for the second time in longer than she could remember, and she held that silent child until the child stopped being quite so silent, and she understood, in that moment, that whatever fence she had built to survive her own grief was never going to hold against a house that had already, quietly, without asking her permission, decided she belonged inside it. She unpacked the carpetbag that night, but the note at the bank still stood, and 30 days had become 22, and Constance Whitmore's whispers had not stopped simply because a barn had burned and a mute child had found her voice. If anything, they had grown louder, curdling now into something with real teeth because word had begun to spread that Holt Ashworth was in financial trouble, and there is no crueler sport in a small town than watching a proud man fall, especially when a woman like Constance Whitmore is standing ready to point out exactly whose fault it was. The 22 days that followed tested every ounce of quiet competence Maren Colby possessed, and every ounce of stubborn silence Holt Ashworth had built his whole life around, and by the time they were through, both of them would understand that surviving a crisis together and choosing to stay together afterward were 2 very different kinds of courage. Holt did not tell the children the full truth of what the bank's letter meant. Not at first, because he was the kind of man who believed that a burden shared with a child too young to carry it was not kindness, but cowardice dressed up as honesty. But children, especially children who have already lost one parent to circumstances beyond their understanding, are rarely as unaware as the adults around them hope. Josephine, running the household's accounts in her careful 13-year-old hand because her father had taught her to, and because someone in that house needed to know where every dollar went, found the banker's letter in her father's desk while looking for a pencil, and read it twice before she understood what it meant, and did not sleep that night at all. She came to Maren before dawn, dark circles under her eyes, and set the letter on the kitchen table between them. "He's going to lose the land," Josephine said. Her voice was very steady, the voice of a girl who had trained herself out of panic, the way you'd train a young horse out of a bad habit, through sheer repetition of calm, half his range, in 3 weeks. "And it's because of the Whitmores, isn't it? Because of what they're saying about you and Papa." Maren considered lying to her. She considered it seriously, for the length of one held breath, because Josephine was 13 and had already carried more than any child should carry, and here was one more terrible truth being handed to her at the kitchen table before sunrise. But Maren had built her whole life, since her husband died, around the conviction that the truth, however hard, was owed to people who had earned it through their own suffering, and Josephine Ashworth had earned this truth several times over. "Yes," Maren said, "I believe that's exactly why." Josephine's chin did not tremble this time. Something harder came into her young face instead, something that looked, for just a moment, uncannily, like her father's stillness, right before he made up his mind about something. "Then we'll have to fix it," Josephine said, "won't we?" It was Josephine, in fact, who first suggested the idea that would eventually turn the whole crisis on its head, though it would take another 2 weeks, and considerably more suffering before that idea bore fruit. She remembered. She'd told Marin that her mother used to speak of a market for preserved goods down in the county seat: jams, pickled vegetables, smoked meat sold to the hotels and the railroad supply houses that fed travelers passing through, and that her mother had once, before she got sick, spoken of setting up just such a small trade herself, using the ranch's own surplus before there had never been time. "You cook better than anyone in this county," Josephine said, with the blunt confidence of a child who has decided to believe in something because the alternative is unbearable. "What if we did it? What if we did what Mama wanted to do? It was not, on its own, going to save half a range of grazing land in 3 weeks. Marin knew enough arithmetic to know that, but it was something, and something was more than the nothing they'd had the day before. And, more than that, it gave the whole grieving household a task to throw itself into together, which turned out to matter more than the money itself. What followed was 12 days that Marin would remember, for the rest of her life, as some of the hardest and finest of it. The whole family, all 5 children, and eventually Holt himself, coming in from the range at dusk to find his kitchen transformed into something like a small factory, jars boiling in great washtubs, the smell of vinegar and sugar and wood smoke thick in every room, threw themselves into putting up preserves, smoking what meat could be spared, packing crates of goods to be sold on consignment through a hotel supplier Marin had once known in her married life, a man named Otis Gray, who ran the supply concern at the county seat depot and who remembered Marin's cooking from a church social years back and was willing, as a favor and a gamble both, to take her goods on commission. Daniel, whose anger had for months found no outlet but destruction, discovered that he had a genuine skill for the physical labor of it, hauling wood, tending the smoking fires, the kind of hard, useful work that let a boy burn off grief through his muscles instead of his temper, and something in him settled over those 12 days. In a way that Marin had been quietly hoping for since the day she arrived. Ruth found her voice growing steadier by using it to call out jar counts and label instructions, small practical sentences that asked nothing emotional of her, and therefore came easier, until by the 5th day she was speaking almost normally, at least inside the walls of that kitchen. Sam, given the job of the littlest hands wiping jars, fetching corks, stopped fixating quite so hard on the fear of forgetting, because he was too busy being useful and proud of it, and even the baby propped in a basket in the corner where she could watch the whole chaotic operation, cried less in those 12 days than she had in the 6 months prior. As though she too understood, in whatever way infants understand such things, that the house around her had found its footing. And Holt came in from the range those 12 evenings to find his silent house full of noise and steam, and his children laughing. Actually laughing, a sound the house had nearly forgotten how to make, and he would stand in the kitchen doorway some nights for a full minute before anyone noticed him there, just watching, his face doing something complicated that he did not have words for and did not try to find them. On the 9th night, he finally came all the way into the kitchen instead of just standing at its edge, and picked up a ladle without being asked, and began stirring a pot of preserves at Marin's side the same way he had once, months back, picked up a dish towel unasked. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly, echoing, without seeming to realize it, the very words she had once said to him in the ashy dawn after the fire. "I did," Marin said, echoing her own answer back to him deliberately, and she saw the corner of his mouth move, not quite a smile, but close enough to its shadow that her chest went tight and warm at the same time. "Marin." He said her name, and then stopped, the way he always stopped, and she waited, ladle in her hand, giving him the silence to fill however he chose. "I've been meaning to say, these 3 weeks, if it comes to it, if the land goes." I want you to know that isn't the thing I'm afraid of losing." He did not finish the sentence. He never finished sentences that got close to the vulnerable part. But this time, for the first time, he had gotten close enough that Maren understood exactly what the unfinished half would have said. And she set the ladle down, and she reached over, and she covered his hand with hers on the handle of the pot, and she said quietly, "I know. I'm not going anywhere either, Holt. Whatever happens with the land," and that was as far as either of them went that night, because some truths need a great deal of time to walk all the way across a room, but it was further than either of them had gone before, and it was enough, that night, to carry them both to sleep. The preserves and smoked goods sold. Otis Gray, true to his word, moved every crate through the hotel trade within a week, and the little venture that had begun as a grieving family's way of feeling useful together turned out to bring in a genuinely meaningful sum, not the whole of what the bank demanded, not nearly, but a real dent in it, and more than that, proof. When Holt rode into the county seat to make his partial payment and lay out a longer repayment schedule to a banking board that included men besides Aldous Whitmore, that the Ashworth operation was solvent, industrious, and very much not the failing household Constance Whitmore had been quietly suggesting it was. Two of the other board members, men who had known Holt's father and respected the son, pushed back hard against calling the full note due on schedule, arguing there was no sound business reason to ruin a paying rancher over a personal grudge, and Aldous Whitmore, caught between his wife's campaign and his own board's plain business sense, was forced to grant an extension. The land for now was safe, but Constance Whitmore was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly, and the near loss of the Eastern Range had only sharpened her resolve rather than dulled it. If money could not be used to pry Maren Colby loose from that household, then reputation would have to do the work instead. And reputation, Constance had learned across a long career of small-town social warfare, was a far more efficient weapon than any banknote, because it required no signature, no board approval, no proof at all. Spoken to the right people, at the right volume. It was at the church harvest social, 3 weeks after the note had been renegotiated, that Constance Whitmore made her move in the open, in front of half the town, in a way that could not be walked back by whispers alone. The social was held in the churchyard under strings of lantern light, tables laden with the town's collective cooking, children running between the adults' legs, the fiddle player warming up his strings for the evening's dancing. Maren had come with the Ashworth children. At Holt's own insistence, "You'll come as family," he had said simply, the closest he had ever come to naming, out loud, what she had become to that household, and she had worn her better dress, the good blue one, and had spent the walk-over feeling something dangerously close to happiness, which should have warned her, if anything could have, that trouble was coming. Constance Whitmore waited until the tables were laid and half the town had gathered near the punch bowl before she made her play, raising her voice just enough to be heard by a wide circle without seeming, to anyone watching casually, to be raising it at all, a skill she had spent decades perfecting. "I do think it's a fine thing," she said to no one in particular, and everyone at once. "When a man opens his home to charity cases, Mr. Ashworth's late wife would be so pleased, I'm sure, to see a common cook standing in her place at the harvest social, in her own good blue dress no less. Though I understand the dress was a gift. From the household accounts, one does wonder what else has been drawn from those accounts these past months, for a woman with no more claim on that family than her wages entitle her to." The words landed exactly where Constance intended them to land, in the soft, unprotected place where a woman's whole worth could be reduced in one sentence to a transaction, a paid position, a borrowed dress, a charity case dressed up as belonging. Maren felt the blood leave her face. She felt every eye in that circle turn toward her, felt Josephine's hand grip her arm hard enough to bruise, felt the whole warm evening go suddenly, achingly cold. She had a rule: never cry in front of others. She held to it now with everything she had left, though it cost her more than it ever had before, because this time there were children watching who loved her, and she would not let them see her broken by a woman like Constance Whitmore. "You're right that I'm only a cook," Marin said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any reason to expect. "I never claimed to be anything else. I don't believe I need to be anything else, to have looked after those children when they needed looking after, or to have earned my place at this table the same as anyone standing here tonight." It was a fine answer. It was not, in the eyes of a churchyard crowd trained by years of Constance Whitmore's careful cultivation, quite enough to overcome the accusation itself, and Marin felt the circle around her drawing subtly inward, the particular tightening of a crowd deciding, collectively, which side of a story to believe. And that was when Holt Ashworth, who had been standing 20 feet away speaking with two of his ranch hands, turned and saw his family surrounded and crossed that churchyard in a way that made every conversation in his path fall silent. Because a man built like Holt Ashworth crossing a crowd, with that particular look on his face, was not a thing anyone in Larkspur Hollow had witnessed before, and it silenced the yard more completely than any words could have. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But when he spoke, every person in that churchyard heard him plainly. "Mrs. Butt Whitmore," he said, "I'll thank you to leave off discussing my household accounts, since you've never once been invited to review them, and I'll thank you further to leave off discussing the woman standing beside my children, since she has done more for this family in 6 months than half this town managed in the 18 months before she arrived, myself included." He paused, and the pause had weight to it, the weight of a man who had spent a year and a half not finishing sentences, and had finally decided to finish this one all the way through. "Marin Colby carried my children out of a burning barn with her own hands. She has fed them, clothed them, taught my mute daughter to speak again, and put more of her own labor into saving this ranch than any hired hand on my payroll. If that makes her a charity case in your eyes, Mrs. Whitmore, then I'd say the charity's been running in the other direction entirely, and this family's been the ones receiving it." Constance Whitmore's face went through several colors in quick succession, none of them flattering, and she opened her mouth to answer, and found for perhaps the first time in her long career of social warfare that she had nothing ready to say. It was into that silence that another voice spoke, one that surprised the whole crowd more than Holt's had, because it belonged to Constance Whitmore's own housekeeper, a stout, quiet woman named Bertha Klein, who had worked in the Whitmore household for 11 years and had never, in all that time, been heard to contradict her employer in public. "If I might say," Bertha said, stepping forward, twisting her hands in her apron but not backing down, "I've heard Mrs. Whitmore's opinion of Mrs. Colby a good many times over the supper dishes these past months, and I've held my tongue because it isn't my place. But I've also heard, from my own sister who does washing out at the Ashworth place, what that woman's done for those children. And I don't believe it's Christian, ma'am, begging your pardon, to tear down a widow doing honest work just because she doesn't fit your notion of who ought to be standing beside a wealthy man. My own mother cooked in a rich house for 30 years, and never once was she less than a fine woman for it." She stopped, red-faced at her own boldness, but did not take the words back. The crowd's tightened circle, which had been closing in around Marin, began instead, slowly to loosen and turn, the particular reversal of a small town's judgment when it senses all at once that it has been standing on the wrong side of a story, and old Mr. Denning, Halloran, a rancher near 80 who had known 3 generations of both the Ashworth and Whitmore families, cleared his throat and added, in his creaking, unhurried voice, that he'd always found it a poor sort of Christian charity that only extended to folks who already had enough. And that, in his long experience, it was usually the woman with the least to spare who ended up doing the most actual saving, and several heads nodded at that, and the fiddle player, sensing the moment had turned, struck up a lively tune, and the harvest social resumed around Constance Whitmore's stiff, humiliated silence, like water closing over a dropped stone. She left early that evening, her husband trailing after her with an expression of long-suffering apology directed at anyone who would meet his eye, and Larkspur Hollow, for its part, spent the rest of that harvest social doing what small towns do best once they've decided to reverse a verdict, falling over themselves to make up for lost time. Offering Maren plates of food and warm words, and in several cases apologies so thinly disguised as compliments that she had to hide a smile behind her hand. Holt found her afterward near the edge of the lantern light, where she had stepped away for a moment to let her heart settle. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "Months sooner. I let you carry that whole weight alone because I didn't trust myself to say it right, and I'm sorry for that." "You said it exactly right tonight," Maren said. "That's more than most men manage in a lifetime, Maren." He started her name the way he always did, and this time he did not stop. "I'm not a man who's good with words, and I never will be, not the way you deserve. But I know this house was a grave before you came into it. Every one of us was just going through the motions of living in it. And you didn't fix that by being clever, or by being anything other than exactly what you are. You fixed it by staying, by choosing to stay, every single day, when nobody would have blamed you for leaving. I don't want to cook, Maren. I never did. Not really, not after the first month. I want you. However, you'll have me." There, under the lantern light, with the fiddle playing and the whole town's redeemed goodwill washing warm around them, Maren Colby finally let her fence come all the way down, and she did not cry from sorrow this time, but from the particular relief of a woman who has spent a year and a half believing herself unworthy of exactly this. At last that she was wrong. "I'll have you," she said, "for however long you'll keep me." "The rest of my life," Holt said, "if you'll let me offer that much." They were married the following spring, in that same churchyard, under a sky washed clean by an early rain, and every one of the 5 Ashworth children stood at the front of that small gathering. Josephine, no longer carrying a household alone on her young shoulders, but sharing the weight with a mother who had chosen her. Daniel, Tia, his anger settled now into something more like his father's steadiness, save for the rare moment when it still flared and was still always met with patience rather than punishment. Ruth, speaking now in full and ordinary sentences, though she still stitched in her spare hours. Small, careful shapes that told the story of a family better than words ever could. Sam, no longer afraid of forgetting, because he had learned from Maren herself that love does not require you to hold on to every detail perfectly in order to keep it alive. And the baby, walking now on unsteady legs between her brothers and sisters, no longer the household's watchman for sorrow because there was, at long last, so little sorrow left in that house to watch for. Constance Whitmore did not attend the wedding, though her husband did, sent by a board of bank directors who understood, better than his wife ever had, which side of a ledger it paid to stand on. Bertha Klein came and cried through the whole ceremony, and old Mr. Halloran gave a toast at the small gathering afterward that ran 20 minutes longer than anyone expected, and that not one person in attendance minded in the slightest. Years later, when the Ashworth Ranch had grown wider still, and its cattle were known across 3 counties for their quality, and when Josephine had grown into a young woman who ran her father's books with the same steady competence she'd shown as a girl, and Daniel had taken over the breeding operation with a gentleness that surprised everyone who remembered his angry childhood, and Ruth had married a quiet man who loved her stitched pictures enough to frame every one she ever gave him, and Sam had grown tall and easy and unafraid, and the baby had grown into a girl who did not remember a single day of the grief that once filled that house, because there had been none left by the time she was old enough to notice. In those later years it was old Mr. Blanup, Halloran in his rocking chair on his own porch, who liked to tell the story to any young person willing to sit and listen, the story of the cook who came to a grieving house with nothing but a carpetbag and a tin of cinnamon, and who was told by half a town that she was only a cook, and only a widow, and only a woman without enough claim to matter. They were wrong about her, the old man would say, rocking slowly, looking out over land that had once nearly slipped away over a banker's spiteful note. Because being only a cook never stopped her being everything else besides. A mother to children who needed one, a wife to a man who'd forgotten how to hope for one, a whole home built up out of nothing but her own two hands and her own stubborn refusal to believe the worst thing anyone ever said about her. He would pause here the way old men do when they've reached the part of a story that matters most to them personally and add, quietly, almost to himself, "That's the thing about home, you understand. It was never about the house, or the land, or the money in the bank. It was about somebody staying, when leaving would have been so much easier because they'd decided you were worth staying for. That's all home ever really is. Somebody deciding you're worth the staying." And then he would fall quiet and rock and watch the sun go down gold over the Ashworth Range, satisfied that he had told the story the way it deserved to be told, which is to say, honestly and all the way to its true and rightful end.